This is Justin Goldner from Funky Butter Productions, and in this piece for Reverb.com, we're going to go over some tricks in Ableton Sampler for taking acoustic instruments and sounds and turning them into playable sampler instruments and soft synths. So for this first patch, I started with an adungu, which is a little 4-string harp instrument that a friend bought me back from Kenya. But with only 4 strings, it's tough to play any sort of melody on it. So first thing I did was I recorded it into Ableton. And then by control clicking and going to slice to new MIDI track, you can create a sampler instrument with that. Over here I've got some macros that I created. You can see how they're mapped with the different parameters, mostly just of Ableton's native sampler. Also I used Corpus and some other, this is just a reverb over here. Let's take a listen to how they affect the sound. This is just a little loop that I created. And one thing that I like to use is this stereo macro over here, which, as you can see, affects this parameter on the filter global tab, which is pan to random. So basically, every time a MIDI note is played, it adds a degree of randomness to where in the stereo field, how far off from center that note is played. Listen to how that sounds. And the higher the value, the wider the spread off from center it'll be. You can add some reverb, of course, to the dry patch. You can hear that here. And the other thing I used was Corpus, which is an Ableton plugin that essentially functions sort of like a modeling synth. Basically, it can add a resonant frequency, a resonant attack to your acoustic sound. So I made this macro, which I called Bell, which is basically just the wet-dry return on Corpus. So then the other macro I made, Reso Mod I called it, is basically mapped to each of the LFO mod parameters over there in Corpus. So let's hear how that sounds. Cool, so all of that is just coming from this original acoustic adungu sound. So this next patch I took from a little Japanese bell, again, that a friend brought me back. And we can go over and listen to what that originally sounded like down here. So that's our source audio. And something that's kind of fun that I tried differently on this one is instead of splitting the 5 sounds across the keyboard, I layered them one over the other. So if we look at our sampler plugin and go into the zone tab, you can see 5 different samples that are layered over the entire keyboard, but then based on velocity, depending what the velocity is, we'll hear a different combination of each of those samples. So let's listen to that. Here's another loop of the Japanese bell. And then let's take a look at some of these parameters. Here's our reverb, which is just mapped to the dry wet return on the reverb plugin. And then a delay. Now, this macro is mapped to affect both the dry wet return on the delay, but also the feedback control. So the higher that macro goes, the more feedback we're going to hear, in addition to the wet signal. Now, something I really like in Ableton Sampler plugin is that you can make a pitch envelope, just like a synthesizer. So this macro that I called pitch envelope goes over to this pitch envelope in the pitch oscillator tab. This is the envelope that we're looking at, and this envelope is then used to modulate the pitch of the sample. And the pitch envelope macro is mapped to both the number of semitones of pitch, and also to the decay value of that envelope. So the higher the value, the longer it takes for the sample to return to its original pitch. And over here, we've got a wave shaper built into Ableton Sampler down here, which has 4 different algorithms for wave shaping, which is essentially distorting a waveform by responding to its amplitude. And just by cranking up the shaper macro, you can hear how it affects both the level and also distorts it somewhat, makes it a little bit more crunchy. Here's our stereo pan to random thing again. And also, Ableton Sampler has this filter that I mapped to a low-pass filter macro that affects both the cutoff frequency, but also the resonance, and also the morph parameters in our sampler plugin. So using these macros, we can take this basic bell sound into something that's a bit more synthy, but still comes from an organic place. One other patch we're going to take a look at. This actually comes from my Yamaha VSS30, which we discussed earlier in the Reverb.com article. This one is actually based on one of the native VSS30 sounds, so it's not even originally a sample. But after messing with it on the VSS30, I sampled it into Ableton to take advantage of Ableton's other capabilities and parameters. So let's give that a listen. So you can hear it started as a weird lo-fi pad with a slow vibrato, but it sounds pretty one-dimensional. And immediately we can use Ableton's detuned stereo spread. I made a macro, but it's over here in the pitch oscillator tab of Sampler. And that just detunes the sound and makes it stereo. So it basically detunes the sound. And then we can also use the stereo random parameter that we talked about before. Another thing I love in Ableton Sampler is making use of this FM frequency modulation or AM amplitude modulation, just like an old FM synth. We only have one operator, unlike a DX7, which has 6. But by using this envelope over here, we can frequency modulate the original sample. Get some very interesting sounds with it. And then one other thing. So we've got some LFOs here in Ableton Sampler. And LFO 3 I have set to a sample and hold LFO. But it's a stereo LFO. So you can see how the 2 channels affect the left and right channels of the sample differently. So by using width and some other parameters, I've mapped the LFO 3 over to the filter. And let's see how that affects the sound. So LFO 3 is affecting that filter over here. And listen to how it affects the left and right channels differently. So you get even more of a stereo effect. So let's see what that all sounds like together with a drum loop. And that's it. There's a lot more you can do within Ableton Sampler and with other native and non-native Ableton plugins. But these are just a couple tricks for taking acoustic instruments or sounds and turning them into weird synthy MIDI sampler instruments. So try it out yourself. This is Justin Goldner again for Funky Butter Productions and Reverb.com. Thanks.